talking about inflammation today. Okay. So hopefully, are we good to go, Steph? Can you see the title?
Yes, I can see your slide.
Perfect. Just wanted to make sure. Okay, so like Steph has said, this has been part of a series. While it's not necessary for you to have seen the previous ones, I do build upon some of that information, but I still also try to explain it in a way that this one can stand alone. So we are going to be looking at inflammation. And get my controls to work here. That's just who I am, and I've already briefly introduced myself, so we will skip right over and jump right into where we're supposed to be today. So we're talking about inflammation, so I find it kind of helpful to start with a definition of what inflammation really is. And if we think about it generally, it's really that immune system's response to any irritant, okay? Even stress, which is what we talked about last month. And many chronic diseases are actually starting to be linked to not only stress, but to this chronic low-grade, sometimes called silent inflammation. Okay, so things like heart disease, obesity, high cholesterol, diabetes, and even mental health issues such as depression and anxiety are being shown to have a possible inflammatory link. Now, again, in terms of the mental health conditions, a lot of times this is individual because we know that there are a lot of different drivers for that diagnosis, but inflammation is one possible one. So just to give you an idea of some of the research that's behind some of the things that I've been saying, there was a paper that was published in 2018, actually, pretty recently. And it argued that inflammation is the driving force behind heart disease. It's not necessarily cholesterol itself. And they suggested that cholesterol was only a product of the underlying inflammation, which is kind of a new twist. We don't often hear about that. We hear cholesterol is bad, and it kind of gets left at that, right? But what they're finding, even in other studies, there is an actual inverse correlation between inflammation and HDL levels. Now, HDL levels are your good cholesterol. And what they're finding is that the more inflammation you have, the lower your good levels of cholesterol are. So, you know, what this kind of highlights for me is that some of these medications, you know, we're really, it's only a Band-Aid. You know, we're targeting, we're putting a Band-Aid on something that might require surgery, right? It is kind of the analogy I like to think about when we're only addressing cholesterol. We really need to be addressing inflammation, which is more of that root cause kind of thing. And just to link it back, why this is important, right? We're talking, this is food and mood. Cholesterol is actually necessary for mood, as well as many other, you know, bodily functions, right? It's used in cell membranes. It's what, about 25%, if I remember correctly, of your brain. And it helps with brain function. And even it's one of the main hormone producers, right? A lot of our steroid hormones, sex hormones are coming from cholesterol. So what we're finding is that low levels of cholesterol can be just as dangerous as high levels of cholesterol when we consider things like depression and suicide. They've actually found that the risk of suicide and depression go up as cholesterol goes down. And we're talking about really low levels, right? But like less than 160 total cholesterol. But they're also finding this with vitamin D, and vitamin D needs cholesterol. So that kind of gives you just a little overview of something maybe we don't think about normally. There was also a study published in 2015 that started looking at how inflammation may be a driver of depression and may be responsible for depression symptoms such as, low mood and lack of energy, lack of appetite, impaired sleeping, and things of that. And specifically, what they found with some of this research is that higher level of those inflammatory markers are present in those with depression, and that those who have those higher levels of inflammatory markers, and we're talking about things like C-reactive protein or interleukin 6. There's no need for you to necessarily remember those, but that these inflammatory markers are often present in those with depression, and those who have those inflammatory markers are less likely to respond to antidepressant medications. Anti-inflammatories can actually help them. So we're definitely seeing a link. Inflammation also disrupts serotonin metabolism. We often hear about depression being linked to a neurotransmitter imbalance, but inflammation can also disrupt serotonin metabolism. And so instead of going and making the amino acid tryptophan is actually what comes in, but instead of making serotonin and then melatonin that helps us sleep, tryptophan gets diverted into a different pathway, and it creates, you guessed it, neuroinflammation, right? Okay. Now, this is not all to say that all inflammation is bad, right? Inflammation is supposed to be protective when it's acute and when it's allowed to naturally resolve. But just like with stress, when it becomes chronic, then we really start to see those issues, right? And so modern lifestyles is really what we're going to start to talk about today, and focus on not just one particular food, but focusing on the lifestyle a little bit as well. So just so you kind of know where I'm driving this boat. Okay, so if we look at some causes of inflammation, we could have built this whole series around this one graphic. And had I found it earlier, I probably would have. But I literally just found it. It's from the book Eat to Beat Depression by Drew Ramsey. And if you were with us last month, we talked about the antidepressant food scale score. Okay, and so he was one of the researchers who helped develop that. And he talks about it again in this book. But you can see how everything that we've talked about in this series so far is literally listed as a cause of inflammation. You've got the poor diet, right? Which we're going to focus on a good bit today. But you've also got things like environmental toxins and that microbiome sort of disruption, right? Obesity and the lack of physical activity, sleep deprivation. We're talking about that next month, right? So be sure to tune in for that one. But even things like social isolation, think about what that means in terms of the last 2 years. We're just coming out of this pandemic where we were forced into pretty much isolating. So thinking about how that can just bring about some of those inflammatory situations. And then, of course, the biggie up there at the top, you've got that chronic stress element. And chronic stress can actually lead to an inflammatory response in the body. All right. So just this kind of sets it out really well for where we've been as well as where we are going. Okay. So like I mentioned, it's not really a single food. Okay. It's probably not going to be a single food that makes a difference. It's really more about the combined approach of an anti-inflammatory eating pattern, which we'll talk about, as opposed to the standard American diet, and then those healthy lifestyle habits, okay, those anti-inflammatory lifestyles, okay? So actually, I found this quote by Dr. Edwin McDonald, and he put it this way, and I thought it summed it up really well. And he says that people really need to focus on their pattern of eating as opposed to eating a few particular foods to reduce inflammation. There's no miracle food out there that's going to cure people with chronic inflammation. You need to have an anti-inflammatory lifestyle and diet. Okay. And so he is actually, this was written at the University of Chicago Medicine blog, but he has his own blog called The Doc's Kitchen. So I wanted to throw that up there for you so that you could see that there are resources out there. He is actually, not only is he a gastroenterologist, a GI doctor, but he is also a trained chef. And so he brings a lot of this information together, talking about the benefits of food, gives you the research behind it, but then talks about how it can benefit you in terms of disease. So a nice little resource that I thought you might enjoy. Now, when we talk about anti-inflammatory lifestyles, we're really talking about this whole aspect. We're taking in all aspects of health, right? And what that means might be, to include things like exercise, stress reduction. Are you getting adequate restorative sleep? Do you have that socialization and support? As well as, what is your vagus nerve doing? Okay, so if you've been with us, again, you've heard this idea of the vagus nerve mentioned multiple times before. Okay, and then you've got diet, right? So we're going to focus on diet more, like I said, but I'll also give you a couple of tools that you can use to be a part of that anti-inflammatory lifestyle. So hopefully you'll leave here at least with some ideas of something that you can do to start to lower inflammation. Okay, so if we consider, what does diet have to do with inflammation, you may notice that some of you may have seen this slide before, but we're really talking about that the nutrients in food are needed to combat all these different things: stress, trauma, inflammation, mental, physical health issues. And unfortunately, the standard American diet is just not where it's at. It can be highly inflammatory, and it doesn't provide these nutrients in sufficient quantities for most people, right? So again, we will look at this anti-inflammatory eating pattern because there's several different ways to do this, and they've been shown to be beneficial in treating this inflammation. Okay, so let's look at some of the foods specifically that can affect inflammation, and start getting into that diet a little bit more. If we look at the standard American diet, like I said, it truly is sad. It is characterized by what I call high foods, right? High fat, high sugar, high salt. They're often overly refined, overly processed, and we eat them because they're convenient. We're eating on the run, right? And they're loaded with these inflammatory fats. Okay, now that can be an overabundance of omega-6 fats or trans fats. So there's a lot of different things in there. Let's focus first on the omega-3s and omega-6s. Okay, so omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, and they actually help to balance the omega-6s in the diet, which can be inflammatory, right? We need both, right? But we need them in balance. So a typical omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in the standard American diet is estimated to be as high as 20 or even 25 to 1 in some cases, okay? And large contributors to this high omega-6 content come from, a lot of it comes from vegetable oils, such as corn oil, soybeans, safflower oil. The ideal ratio, again, this is an estimate, but they suggest a 1-to-1 or even a 3-to-1, somewhere in between there might be ideal. What they found is that ratios of less than 5-to-1, so remember that's, omega-6 to omega-3, 5-to-1, have been found to be anti-inflammatory in general. Okay, and they can lower your risk of chronic disease. But you can think 5-to-1 compared to the standard American diet, even if we take the lower estimate of 20-to-1, that's a big difference. Okay, Ratios around 10-to-1 we see that switch get flipped, and they tend to be more pro-inflammatory at that point. Now, if we consider omega-3s, we're actually talking about a lot of the times those brain building fatty acids that we hear about with fish oil, right? So you're getting that EPA and that DHA, and those really help to modulate inflammation, not only in the body, but in the brain. And some of the newer research coming out now, and I find that this is really fascinating. I would say within the last 8 to 10 years, maybe, is that there's also some very specialized omega-3 fatty acids. They come from the DHA piece, but they're called resolvins, and they're involved in the resolution of tissue inflammation. So what they've decided to call them are specialized pro-resolving mediators, all right, or SPMs. And I've started noticing that they are starting to pop up on some fish oil supplements. So if you see those, that's kind of the reason behind it and what they're doing. They're more precisely targeting inflammation, okay? But the standard American diet also lacks whole foods, such as those fruits, those vegetables, those whole grains, and it is overly loaded with pesticides and possible toxins, right? So with this lowered intake of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and even the fiber, then you can understand why that standard American diet may be more inflammatory, okay? And we know that a lack of fiber also impacts that microbiome as well. So if we look more specifically, let's take sugar. And again, this is not a sugar workshop, but I do just want to bring your awareness to a few points. Sugar is one of the more inflammatory types of foods, and many times we do not realize really how much sugar we're eating. Okay, so the American Heart Association recommends having no more than 10% of your daily calories from added sugars. Some agencies are more conservative with this and suggest bringing that down to about 5% of your daily calories. But if we consider that 10% mark, then that means that roughly around 25 grams of sugar for women, which is about 6 teaspoons, okay, or 6 sugar cubes, you could think about it like that, and about 37 grams or just over those 9 teaspoons for men. If you do see in the graphic, it says that the average added sugar intake accounts for about 266 kilocalories a day. Okay, so if you put this in perspective, that equates to almost 67 grams of sugar per day. Okay, or 17 teaspoons, right? Okay, so that's almost triple the amount for women that I just gave you that was recommended, and it's nearly double what's recommended for men. Okay, now you put that on top of estimates that suggest that the average American consumes well over 100 pounds of sugar per year, and you can see where some of this inflammation is coming from. And sugar actually creates blood sugar and insulin spikes, and it can impact fatty acid metabolism and can drive inflammation, and also depletes a lot of those nutrients that help build stress resilience, right? So you can kind of think about where we're going with that. If we look at it, insulin will actually upregulate an enzyme that converts those omega-6s into those pro-inflammatory compounds. And so that kind of helps explain the link while we see this high fat, high sugar, and we start to see how that impacts, even stress, chronic disease, diabetes, obesity, as well as, even things like depression. Okay. Let's look at trans fats, refined carbs, and additives. Okay, so trans fats are actually considered one of the worst types of fats, and they have been linked to elevated levels of LDL cholesterol, right? The bad kinds of cholesterol. And they do lower that HDL as well. They've been linked to several chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, and they're often found in those processed baked goods. So your packaged cookies and cake mixes, your icing, donuts, those sorts of things, and they're really packed with those inflammatory types of nutrient deplete foods or substances, right? And they can actually be addictive. All right. So if you want a review of that, remember, go back and look at some of the stuff we've done with the sugar addiction before. But if we look at that standard American diet, over 60% of the foods eaten by Americans are actually processed types of foods. They're full of additives, they're full of chemicals, and those health depleting substances, right? They're sucking those vitamins, minerals, and nutrients out, or filling you up so that you don't have room to eat those healthy things, right? So you can kind of think where we're, as our American diet continues this way, what that's looking like, the higher disease rates, chronic illness, those sorts of things, not to mention the mental health epidemic that we're finding ourselves in. Okay, so sugar, high glycemic load carbs are often found in these highly processed and refined packaged products, right? You've got your cookies, your crackers, your pasta, your bread, a lot of high glycemic load carbohydrates there. And they do create those blood sugar imbalances, like I mentioned before. So, what about artificial sweeteners? Well, Amber, you're telling me sugar's not good. I get it. We've heard it, right? Okay. Well, alternative sweeteners, they've actually been recently shown to impact the gut microbiome as well. And so questions have been raised as to if they do more harm than good in several cases, because they may, okay, big keyword there, they may contribute to further inflammation, weight gain, and even diabetes in the long run. But the effects may depend more on the overall diet composition. Okay, just like we're looking at overall anti-inflammatory lifestyle, it's not necessarily about one food. What does the rest of your diet look like? How many calories are you taking in, etc.? So that may be a critical factor in whether or not some of these alternative sweeteners will have an effect. Still to be determined. All right. Again, some of this was gone over in previous workshops, so I don't want to spend a lot of time there. But just to note that in terms of additives, lots of emulsifiers have been shown to damage the gut, along with pesticide residues, chemical preservatives, food dyes that are commonly found in a lot of these products, right? So if it's on the label and you can't pronounce it, or you don't know what it is, then it's probably not as healthy as it could be. Just a good rule of thumb. And if we look at vegetable oils, fried foods, processed meats, these are all the things that we've heard about. Again, vegetable oils include that corn, soybeans, sunflower, safflower oil, and they have that high omega-6 content. So they can be inflammatory when they're not properly balanced by those omega-3s. And they're often used in fried foods or in high temperature cooking, like with chips and many snack foods, because they have a higher smoke point. So they don't burn, I guess you could think about it. They don't burn as easily, right? Okay. And then there's processed meats, bacon, salami, pepperoni, a lot of your deli meats have been linked to things like colon cancer, heart disease, all diseases, rooted in that inflammation. And so just one possible way to possibly think about how might I limit that, you're sitting there and maybe you say, well, Amber, I like my sandwiches for lunch, right? Which is fine. But one way to possibly limit that might be just to make an extra chicken breast or an extra thing of roast beef when you're making dinner at night and using that occasionally instead of a lunch meat. One other thing that I haven't mentioned so far, and I'm not, this is all I'm going to say about it, but that foods you're sensitive to can also cause this kind of silent inflammation. This could include things like gluten, right? As is my case, right? Gluten and grains, but it could also be things like dairy. A lot of people are intolerant to dairy. And some people even have fruit and vegetable allergies, right? So my daughter's allergic to citrus. Definitely wouldn't want to put that in there. It would cause inflammation. So start thinking about how this is individualized to you. And if you think you might have food allergies or food sensitivities, it's really time to start to talk to your doctor or your dietitian so that you can walk through a good way to address that. Okay. So I threw this in here because I want, as we go through this series, I want you to start to get the whole picture. And we looked at some of these last time. We looked at that antidepressant food scale score. We looked at nutrients that were depleted with stress. And what I really want to highlight here is kind of what I've already alluded to, is that a lot of the same nutrients that fight inflammation are depleted with stress. So you can start to see there is really truly a connection there. And we're not going to go over these in detail, but I did want you to kind of get an idea of some of these, magnesium, B vitamins, a lot of your vitamins, C, A, D, E, K, right? But zinc and iron, you see the omega-3s and that calcium, a lot of these things are needed and may be lacking, especially if you were eating a lot of packaged standard American types of foods. Okay. I'm, like I said, not going to go over these in detail, but just know that if you adopt sort of an anti-inflammatory eating pattern, you're going to get ample of these. And so it's a little bit easier to think about it in that way. And these are just some food examples, right? Foods that are high in these nutrients. So we'll talk more about these specifically, but leafy greens, whole grains, nuts, citrus, dark chocolate, had to put that one on there. It actually has some really good benefits if we're talking about greater than 70% dark chocolate. Your fatty fish, your low-fat dairy, or your dairy alternatives, right? Lean meats, eggs. Eggs have been demonized for quite some time, and really they aren't as bad as what we were led to believe. They're actually a really good source of choline, and choline is one of the building blocks of acetylcholine, which helps to, it's the main neurotransmitter used by that vagus nerve, really. Okay, and so there's actually a thing called the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway as well. So eggs can actually be part of a balanced anti-inflammatory diet. And then, of course, sunshine and rainbows. We've talked about the importance of vitamin D. And a review published in 2020 actually found that vitamin D may influence the status of that gut microbiome and actually exert anti-inflammatory effects, have those immune modulating kinds of effects. And again, low vitamin D can increase that risk for suicide and depression. Okay, so to keep it simple, I'm going to talk about it, in terms of eating the rainbow. And you've heard me say this before, but I think it's important to kind of bring this up. It's a lot easier to think about eating the rainbow than what specific foods did Amber say or my dietitian say were good. Typically, if you can put in more colors, make your plates more colorful, you're going to be moving in the right direction. So you see my Care Bear rainbow. Eat the rainbow for a healthy tummy. Those fruits and vegetables actually contain lots of phytonutrients, lots of different ones. We're not going to go into specific details, but they've got a lot of polyphenols. They've got a lot of flavonoids. They've got a lot of these nutrients that we only find in plants, really. Okay. They also have fiber, vitamins, and minerals, and all of those things can fight inflammation. So again, eat that rainbow. And there's a chart here at the end, but I also sent it out. It was the one that was sent out last month. So if you didn't get it and you think that would be beneficial, I can definitely send that out again. But, thinking about the chart shows the different benefits, and we'll look at those. But, thinking, especially it's March, we start thinking about leprechauns and leafy greens, right? Because green for the month is kind of what I think about. But leafy greens are a powerhouse themselves, right? And if you remember from the antidepressant food scale, leafy greens was one of the top foods loaded with those nutrients to help fight depression, anxiety, and those sorts of things. Okay, but as a few more examples, I'll run through some of these pretty quickly just to give you an idea. Berries actually contain antioxidants called anthocyanins, and they are anti-inflammatory. They're also a low carb kind of fruit, so they're not overly sweet, and they're not going to cause that blood sugar spike. But then you also have things like cruciferous vegetables, okay? Broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, all fall under that general category. And they contain things like sulforaphane, which can lower inflammation. You also have things like quercetin in fruits and vegetables. Quercetin is not only found in the berries and cruciferous vegetables we were just talking about, but it's also present in things like apples and even peppers, okay? And it can help reduce inflammation. And studies are suggesting that it may actually help protect against the severity of COVID. So just kind of thinking about some of those things. And mushrooms have recently been of interest because they can have anti-inflammatory compounds as well. And we're starting to see, we'll talk about teas and stuff here in a minute, but some people are actually making more of a mushroom type of tea as well. So you've got lots of different options. When it comes to lean and clean proteins, things like wild-caught fish, grass-fed meat, organic dairy can all be beneficial. And again, those fatty fish such as salmon, sardines, anchovies are among the highest with that omega-3 content. Okay, so they naturally contain that EPA and DHA. Healthy fats, things like avocados, olive oil, nuts, right? Nuts such as walnuts, almonds, pistachios. But then you've got things like seeds as well. So chia, flax, and hemp. Avocados are actually loaded with a lot of healthy nutrients, and they can help fight inflammation as well. They have fiber, magnesium, potassium, a whole lot of other things. Nuts are actually good in moderation. They can increase the production of a neuroprotective chemical called BDNF, and that helps to offset the damage that stress does, because we know stress can damage and change the structure of the brain. So nuts can actually help protect a little bit. So, those can be really good options. When we talk about fiber and fermented foods, we're really talking more, you may have heard, I kind of think about this in terms of what are your probiotic and prebiotic foods, because we know that fiber helps feed the gut microbiome and helps to increase its what they call richness, or the abundance of the same species of microbe, right? While those fermented foods appear to increase the microbiome diversity, or increase the number of different microbes, all right? So just recently, Dr. Sonnenberg's lab out of Stanford just published a study. I think it was 2020, might have been 2021, but I'm thinking it was 2020. And they actually found, they were looking at this idea of what about fiber? What about fermented foods? How does that impact inflammation. And so what they found was that participants who increased their fermented food consumption were actually found to decrease their inflammatory markers consistently. Okay. When the participants increased their fiber, the response was more variable. Some people experienced a reduction in inflammation, but some people experienced an increase in inflammation. So again, fermented foods and fiber may have a place. Both of them are needed. And it really, when we start talking about fiber, can be an individual type of thing. Like I said, gluten and some grains really bother me. So I can choose other fiber sources. But, for you, it could be totally different. And you totally are fine by increasing fiber using grains. But other options for fiber, all of your fruits and vegetables have fiber, but also your whole grains, your nuts, your seeds, even your beans. Okay. Just keep in mind when you're increasing fiber, it's probably easier on, I guess, your system, right, to do it slowly, because it can affect how full you feel. It can affect your stool consistency, and even, gas production. So thinking about that, your fermented foods include things like your yogurt, your kefir, your sauerkraut, and those can act as those probiotic and prebiotic foods for the gut as well. So feeding and expanding the microbiome, of course. And part of that is done because they produce what's called short chain fatty acids. Okay. And those short chain fatty acids can help to dampen that inflammatory response. Now, when we get to herbs and teas, I'm not going to go over a lot of these, but I do want you to know, just give you a couple of ideas. Turmeric, right, contains curcumin, can be a great option, all sorts of applications. It also increases BDNF that we mentioned. But ginger, garlic, all of those can be anti-inflammatory. Considering things like cloves, cinnamon, cumin. Cumin's a great one. I'm having tacos tonight, so I'll be putting some cumin in my dishes. But even herbs like rosemary and basil have been shown to lower inflammation and protect things like even the gut, right? And tea and coffee even. But the thing is that a lot of times when we have these things, we're adding lots of sugar, we're adding lots of cream, right? And so that's really where we can get into trouble with that. So adding milk to those beverages will actually lessen the effect of the antioxidants that are in there. So you may want to do those separately. But herbal teas are also a great way, right? You could do a ginger tea or a tulsi tea or even a chai. So thinking about lots of different options that would be beneficial for inflammation for the gut, as well as the brain, okay? So just a few strategies to consider. These are more lifestyle types of strategies, right? So tapping can lower stress by about stress hormones by about 45%. And it's also great for food cravings if that's what's driving your inflammation. Breath is one of the most direct ways to activate or access that autonomic nervous system. And so that can impact your stress level and your inflammation level, as well as that gut brain. Maybe try breathing in to a count of 5 and out to a count of 5 can be very beneficial. And you can see some of the others, self-massage, essential oils, taking a walk, getting outside, get that extra vitamin D, walk in nature, green space, right? Can be very therapeutic. But let's do something very, very quickly. I only have a few more slides, but go ahead and unmute yourself if you would. And I know this is kind of unorthodox, but we're gonna try this, okay? Now I want you to start to laugh with me, and you're probably gonna have to make yourself do it to start with. But I really want to hear a Zoom room full of laughing. So I'm gonna start, and y'all just come in with me, okay? Ha ha
That's cute.
Okay, so how did that work? Did you eventually start to laugh naturally? My guess
Yeah.
is many of you probably did, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
laughing has actually been shown not only to lower stress and to activate the vagus nerve, but it also has an anti-inflammatory effect on your system. So the more you can laugh, the better, right? We'll talk about setting a bedtime routine next month. But let's get into looking at the diet and the timing of the eating in our last few minutes together. Okay, so I want to give you 5 options. The first one being an anti-inflammatory eating pattern. Okay, now many diets fall under this general category. There's things like the DASH diet, the MIND diet, the Mediterranean diet, the Okinawan and Norwegian even diets. All of these are sort of anti-inflammatory eating patterns, right? But studies do suggest that individuals who adhere to more of that Mediterranean type of eating pattern, or even that anti-inflammatory type of eating pattern, as opposed to our standard American diet, are less likely to develop those chronic conditions such as heart disease, depression, diabetes, right? And these eating patterns are also helpful in maintaining that microbiome, which we know 70 to 80% of our immune system is actually in the gut itself. So a disrupted microbiome can lead to stress, food cravings, inflammation, all of the above. So we really want to protect that a little bit. Okay, but notice that the base of the anti-inflammatory eating pattern is really based in fruits and vegetables. Okay, the standard American diet is more based in grain products, kind of fits that bottom piece, right? And while those are important in the anti-inflammatory eating pattern when they're whole grains, right, they kind of take a backseat to those fruits and vegetables. And it doesn't include those inflammatory goods that we talked about with that standard American diet, all of that sugar and those baked goods. Those really are limited, as well as red meats are more limited, whereas you're eating more fish types of products here. Okay. So, and fish are those good sources of omega-3s I was telling you about. Turns out that timing your eating may be just as important as what you're eating. Okay, so practice limiting your eating to 12 hours each day. And if you want to work down to narrow that window between 8 to 10 hours, that can be beneficial as well. This is actually called time restricted eating or time restricted feeding. And they found that they can be useful for reducing cravings, improving energy, which goes hand in hand with building that resiliency, but also helping to quell that inflammation and setting that circadian clock. Again, a plug for next month. Okay. So just kind of thinking about that, really trying to take a break after dinner and making sure you get that 12 to 16-hour window for your body to rest. When it rests and the gut rests, it can heal itself, right? Option 3, I've talked about this one, eat the rainbow. This is the exact same slide that I put in last month, because if we're talking about anti-inflammatory types of eating patterns, or, eating patterns that impact stress, we're really talking about eating that rainbow. And I want you just to notice, hopefully you can see it. And like I said, I can send this out again, but the benefits for every single color, you see anti-inflammatory listed. So again, fruits and vegetables are critical for this anti-inflammatory type of lifestyle. Okay. And your reward, you can set a reward, right? But ultimately your reward is less inflammation and better health, and even more variety in your diet, right? Keep it interesting, keep it fun. Option 4, make healthier swaps. I want y'all to know, I could have probably made 3 slides on healthy swaps. And I was like, Amber, you have to stop. Like, but I got into this because I was like, oh, this is fun. Oh, I hadn't tried that myself. Maybe I'll do that too. But I do make a lot of swaps in my household. And so my kids have grown up with some of these. And so you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. But, obviously you can swap just a plain refined sort of bread bagel and cream cheese with using a whole grain bread option, whether that's an English muffin or some sort of roll or literally a piece of whole grain toast. But you can drizzle that with olive oil or top it with avocado, sprinkle it with some fresh herbs. Okay, so there's a lot of ways where you can start to combine a lot of the foods we've talked about and get more of them into your diet very quickly. It's still convenient, right? Chips often contain those inflammatory vegetable oils. We kind of talked about that, but swapping them for whole, fresh food options can be a huge game changer. I think sometimes, I know I like to snack, I like to munch, and sometimes I can get that satisfied by doing mixed nuts and apples, something crunchy that still gives me that without the added inflammation from chips. Okay. Instead of soda or fruit juice, maybe sub in some of that green tea, that herbal tea that we were talking about, or coffee. I love black coffee. That's how I drink it. Not everyone, I realize, likes black coffee, but even that would be an option. Or what about flavoring your water with fresh cut fruit? Okay, if you don't like the taste of water by itself, maybe put in some sweeter berries or even mango or pineapple. Flavor it naturally so that you still get that water, a little bit of that fruit, but it's not going to cause that sugar spike like soda or fruit juice would, right? Condiments, really, on your chicken or your beef, whatever it happens to be. Here I pick barbecue sauce. There's lots of hidden sugars in barbecue sauce. But one option would be to drizzle homemade pesto over your chicken. And I actually have a recipe, and I'm happy to share that with you. But homemade pestos a lot of times have nuts and olive oils, those healthy fats, and greens, right? Those herbs and kinds of things in there to make that pesto. So they can actually be a pretty healthy swap that can help with inflammation. Just subbing in salmon, a side of wild rice, or a whole grain and broccoli for a hamburger or for a steak and baked potatoes. Swapping out a meal a week with fish of some sort can be good. Skipping on traditional dessert, your cakes, your cookies, your pies, and maybe having a bowl of fruit or maybe a single square of dark chocolate. And one thing that I've noticed, because I love chocolate, I seriously could sit down and eat a whole bar. But if I put the square of dark chocolate in my mouth and I hold it there and I let it melt, then 1 at most 2 squares, and I'm done. Everything has been satisfied. So there's also a lot of recipes online that are really focusing on how you can still feel the satisfaction of having dessert, but making it in a healthier sort of way. So like avocado chocolate mousse, for instance. Several recipes on the internet for that as well. And then just swapping sour cream for plain yogurt. Or even, when I make my chicken salad, I'm swapping half of the mayonnaise, and I use an avocado-based mayonnaise as well. But I'll swap half of that out for a plain yogurt. And so those are just some quick ways that you can make some healthy swaps. But think about how you can combine foods or make healthier swaps to get the most bang out of a meal is really what we're focusing on. And then option 5, I had to circle back around. This is food and mood to talk about those probiotics. just to give you another option. Again, if you can get them in your food naturally, that's great. But they can also be found in supplement form. And like we discussed last month, they can, you know, those fermented foods, as well as foods that are grown in good soil, are naturally going to have some of these things. But many probiotics, especially if we look at those lacto and bifido types of strains, and you can see those on the screen there, but they've been shown to reduce stress reactivity, right? Help with depression, help with anxiety, but they've also been shown that they can help regulate that stress-induced inflammation, and that impairment of that sympathetic nervous system, right? When we really get geared into that fight or flight and really stressed out. So they can help to regulate some of that. And like I said, some of the ways they do this include those short chain fatty acids. So what they found is that increased intestinal permeability, going back to that idea of leaky gut that we've talked about, has been associated with that stress and inflammation, as well as depression. And so probiotics can again repair that gut so that it's not as leaky. So I think just a quick video. If this comes up, it may not come up correctly. I may have to change the screen share. Let's see. I don't think it really matters. Let's try this. Can y'all see it? I don't think so. It did not bring that up. Huh. Okay. Well, I was afraid that might happen.
And I'm happy to link it when I send out the materials, Amber, if that would help you.
Yeah, that would be great. Literally, it's like a minute and it sums up everything we've talked about. But that works. We'll open it up to questions. So that, and it looks, am I still screen sharing or are we good?
Nope, you're no longer screen
Good.
sharing.
I thought I turned that off.
Yeah.
Okay. So lots of information. Hope it wasn't too much. I tried to make it simple, but there's just a lot of stuff. Food can do a lot of beneficial things. Are there thoughts or comments or questions? Anybody want to share a healthy swap that they use at their house?
I have a question, Amber, about you were talking about inflammation and a little bit about how it presents itself. And I know it's probably different in each individual, but what are some of the ways that we might start to notice that that's something that we might be struggling with or feeling in some ways?
So like I said, a lot of times, remember I talked about it in terms of silent inflammation. A lot of times we don't know. You may not know until you go to the doctor and they do blood work, right? And they see that you have elevated markers of things like C-reactive protein or some of these inflammatory markers, or your cholesterol is now high, your A1C is now high. Those have been linked to being more inflammatory types of conditions. So anytime you start to see those numbers creeping up, you can assume that you have inflammation. In terms of the gut, talking about food sensitivities, that can be really hard too, because food sensitivities, you may eat a food 3 days earlier and it takes it that long before you start noticing, any sort of discomfort, things like that. So it is very individualized. For some people, it's joint pain. For some people, it might be headaches. For some people, it's upset stomach. Or, you know, like I said, it could be things like those sugar spikes. What's your blood sugar? What's your cholesterol doing? Or mood fluctuations. Okay. So
We had a question about what's your recommendation for the best dark chocolate?
what I have started doing is looking for the ones that have the fewest ingredients. So ones that are mostly chocolate, a little bit of sugar, right? Some sort of natural sweetener, and then everything else is pretty much gone. So it doesn't contain emulsifiers and all those extra things that they can put in there. As far as that gets tricky, Shelley, because everybody has a different taste palette, and some chocolates taste different. I would just encourage you to try different ones that are out there. Some people like a firmer chocolate, some like a smoother chocolate. The more bitter, obviously, the more chocolate percentage is in there. It's going to get a little more bitter.
Sometimes I see this seasonally, but every now and then, if you're someone who goes to Trader Joe's every now and then, I have noticed they will put, it almost looks like a little set of books. And it's usually with like the seasonal section, but I've seen it kind of throughout the year. And I think there's eight different types of dark chocolate, at different percentages, very clean ingredients, very simple. But it's nice. They're small bars, maybe, 3 by 4 inch little bars, to give you an idea of what percentage of the cacao powder that you prefer. So just, keep an eye on that. They may have it at other places too, like World Market or Whole Foods or, stores like that. But I've just seen it in Trader Joe's every now and then. It just catches my eye because it looks like a little stack of books. It's really cute. Yes.
And
I like
I'm
the
taking
taste
it down
test,
for a
Kelly.
taste test.
Yeah. And then Mitzi had given her suggestion of using applesauce instead of oil. And I think that's another great swap. And really, in most baking, like when I use that for muffins and cakes, I actually think it helps it to be a little more moist in the texture of the, baked product. So love it. It's a good suggestion.
Yeah, that's one of the swaps I use constantly in my house. And then a lot of times I find that because I'm not a real sweet person, like I don't, that sounded bad. I'm not a sweet person. I don't like really strong sweet taste. So a lot of times when I use applesauce, because it's naturally sweet, I can also cut the sugar back a little bit. But yeah, that's a great one. That is a great one.
A really good swap.
What was that?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, I have a really good swap for cereal. So I have a guilty pleasure with like the chocolate kind of cereals, like Cocoa Pebbles and like chocolate Cheerios. But if you do a cup, it's like 150 calories for those types of cereals. But what I swap them with is the unsweetened almond milk, which is only like 30 calories for like the cup. So that's what I use. And honestly, you cannot tell a difference with that type of milk in that cereal. So your cereal is only like 170 calories or 180 calories, and you have an awesome cereal. So that's my swap. Guilt-free.
Mm-hmm. That's another good one. Yeah, I like swapping in some of the different milks as well.
I promise you, do not tell a difference in the unsweetened almond milk in your cereal.
And this is really where it's at, right? It's not about deprivation. It's not about taking things away, because what do we do when we take things away? We want them more, right? It's how can I make healthier swaps and still kind of get what my body is craving, right? It's still making me satisfied, but doing it in a way that is maybe more anti-inflammatory than inflammatory. So yeah.
Those milks last longer than your whole milk and your 2% milk. They have longer shelf life in your fridge.
That's
It's
another
very
fun
different.
taste test idea, you know, to look at there's so many different types of dairy or dairy-free milk options. A lot of plant-based options they are out there now. Almond milk, cashew milk, oat milk. I mean, I feel like I go now and it is very different than what I used to see when I went to the stores. It's a little overwhelming, but they can get expensive. So that's a good idea to maybe have a little taste test of some of the plant-based options sometime.
One thing I have found, so some of those milks that are that you think are more expensive, that last for like the ultra pasteurized, they last you for 3 and 4 months. So they really aren't any more expensive because they are lasting you longer. Like for me, when I would buy a half a gallon of milk, it would last me like it was spoiled before I could use it. So now I can buy half a gallon of milk and it will last me 4 months. And so it actually is saving me money. I might spend $1 more half a gallon versus it might cost me $3.99 versus $2.99, but it's actually I'm not throwing it away. So it's actually cheaper for me. So yeah, it's worth it.
Thank you, Connie. Anyone else? I know we've some people had to leave right at 1, and Amber's always so gracious to stay around and answer other questions for anyone. Does anyone else have any questions for Amber? We will, of course, send out the recording and all the resources again, but we do have a couple more minutes if anyone has a question or comment.
Hi, Amber. I'm thinking about the snack swap, and I love chips, and I often see the veggie chips at Harris Teeter, and you're saying that the thing to look for is the fewest ingredients. And I guess if we're looking to purchase pre-made veggie chips, we would probably look for something that isn't fried. But what would be the preferred oil that we should look for? Olive oil, avocado oil.
Yeah, and that could be a whole topic in and of itself. So olive oil is really good, right? Olive oil is really good. But the thing is with olive oil is that when it's heated, especially to really high temperatures, it kind of changes the composition of the fat a little bit. So when I'm thinking about adding an olive oil, I'm really looking at, I know, right? I'm really looking at using that. How can I drizzle that over or maybe lightly saute some of my vegetables in olive oil, use it as a salad dressing, etc. kind of thing. Low temperature or no temperature kinds of applications. Avocado oil can be an option, right? Because it does have a higher smoke point, but it's still not as inflammatory. Now, I will say, you have to watch out for adulterated avocado oils, so make sure if you're using an avocado oil that it's good quality. Chips could certainly be cooked in that, baked options for chips may be better than fried options. You can kind of think about it in that way as well. But then too, like I said, it's not about deprivation necessarily or cutting these things out. If we are balancing our diet with enough omega-3s, we're getting enough of that, that fish, and we're getting enough of, those chia seeds or those flax seeds, we're getting those omega-3s in our system, then having a few chips that are cooked in maybe that sunflower or safflower oil may not be too bad because it'll balance, it'll be fine. It's just when there's an overabundance. Does that help answer your question a little bit? Okay, I got a thumbs up.
All right. Well, thank you again, everybody, for spending time with us today. Oh, we have one more coming through. Oh, I've never tried that. Corinne just made a suggestion. She said her kids and husband love cucumbers with lemon and salt and sometimes some chili pepper. Love it.
Yeah, I like that. I'm gonna have to try
Yummy.
that now. Gives you a nice little crunch. I like that.
Good suggestion. I need to save the chat and write some of these down to include in the resources for some of those that had to leave us a little early or who couldn't make it today. But yeah, well, thank you, Amber. We have one more session left with Amber for this particular series. Session 6 will be on April 26th at noon. And we're going to be Amber is going to be talking with us about food and sleep and our circadian rhythm and how all those things together affect our mood. I can go ahead and tell you how sleep, lack thereof, affects my mood, but I'm interested to see the role that food plays into that as well. So join us back here. And in the meantime, I will be sending out an email with how to get a hold of Amber, along with all the resources from today. So thank you for being with us today, Amber, and thank you everybody else for joining us.
Thank you all.